friends, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Okotla, your host, and this is Roots and Realities, the pod where we sit and talk and get into it. Okay, son, you better come through, son. Thank you.
Let's go. Let's go. Let's go, little kitty. You don't want you anymore. No.
Today we're going to be discussing intergenerational trauma and the need to heal. I think a lot of the times when we think of generational trauma, we think of it as things that yes have come from our parents or our grandparents, but it's also based in our own experience of them, and we see the pattern in our family line. But I'd like to start at a different point completely. There was a book I read last year titled It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolin, and through that book I discovered the difference between trauma as a result of our own lived experience as opposed to trauma that we have inherited from those who came before that have nothing to do with our lived experience. Generational trauma isn't something that is experienced by one person, but instead is an experience or an event or a behavior that extends from generation to generation. There are different types of traumas. There's acute trauma, there's chronic trauma, there's complex trauma, there's also secondary trauma. Acute trauma is a trauma as a result of one single event. It could be the sudden loss of a loved one, it could be a car accident. Chronic trauma is as a result of a prolonged, often inescapable event happening. That could be living in an abusive household. The trauma that I think applies to this particular topic is acute trauma as well as chronic trauma. There's traumas that we may notice in our family that are as a result of things that have been inherited in terms of the way our parents may parent, that is based on how they were parented. There's another aspect of familial trauma that I don't think is spoken about enough, which are the hidden traumas, the unspoken things, the events that have happened before we were even born that are covered in shame and regret and guilt. And so those things, it's very difficult to pinpoint what are the generational trauma or curses or patterns when you don't know the history. If you don't know what happened in the past, you won't be able to identify what are the patterns that are persisting today. With that in mind, I think it's really important to take note and to take an interest into your family history. I think that's one thing that really allowed for me to be able to differentiate between what behaviors and inclinations and tendencies that I may have that are as a result of my own trauma, my own experience, or things that I may have inherited. My biggest fear my whole life, from when I was so young, from as early as I can remember, before I even had a concept of what death was, my biggest fear was losing my mother. And my core language around it was, if I'm not with my mom, something will happen to her. If she's not present, she will die. And when I was reading this book and I was doing the thinking process behind it, I realized that that too was not based on my own lived experience. I hadn't experienced anything with my mom to make me think that distance away from her would mean something that permanent. But I was able to realize and recognize that my grandmother, my father's mom, she lost her mom when she was quite young. She lost her mom when she was 12 years old, and she was the last born. And so I can only imagine my great-grandmother, it was a stomach issue, it was something that should have been a non-issue. I can only imagine during that time, she was probably told, your mom's going to the doctor, she's going to the hospital, she'll be right back. That absence ended up being permanent and she never came back. So I'm sure that there was not a lot of tending to. It's not like grief counseling was a big thing back then. There are so many siblings. My grandmother ended up being raised by her father, who was quite a strict and tough man. The specificity with the language that I had regarding absence with my mom, I was able to recognize that that specific fear came from my grandmother. On the surface, this might sound like an overanalysis or like incredibly but there's actually a biological backing. Trauma changes the way in which our genes appear, and the changes that are made to our genetic code, to our DNA, those are what gets passed down. The reason that our genes change as a result of trauma is out of protection of the next generation. In the book, there was actually a study done with rats and cherry blossoms. These rats were exposed to cherry blossoms, and every time they were hit with an electrical shock. Those rats learned to have a fear of cherry blossoms because they associated it with pain. And so the next generation, despite not being exposed to the cherry blossoms, had a fear of cherry blossoms because there was a genetic change. And so out of protection, out of survival, they learned to fear the thing that could cause them pain, even though they didn't experience that pain themselves. Similarly, descendants of people who experienced the Holocaust and descendants of slavery also do have genetic changes in terms of cortisol and the stress hormone that they experience in their bodies. I think there are ways that we are able to identify traumas that may not come from us, and a really good way to do that is to take an interest in your family history. I think it's so important to ask our parents and our grandparents, if they're still around, about their family history, the family setting, who passed away when, what are specific things that happened, when did family structures change, education levels, location. My dad, for instance, grew up for Zambia most of his childhood, and I think that also helped me be able to locate another fear that I have that I realized didn't necessarily come from me. My dad is a short stories author, in addition to being a lawyer. Okay, shout out my father. And he wrote a short story based on my great-grandfather who passed away in the mines. And so obviously passing away in enclosed space is a trauma all on its own. And I can, from as early as I remember, I've always had an intense fear of enclosed spaces. And I never had a particular experience to make me be that scared, but I was so scared of enclosed spaces to a point where when we be going to the car wash, when we'd be going to the car wash and the soap would wash all over the car and so you wouldn't be able to see outside, I would get this intense fear. Mind you, I'm only 3-4 years old at this point. I would get such an intense fear that I would go and sit from the back seat, undo my seatbelt, and go and sit on my mom's lap and just bury my head in her chest because I got such anxiety with not being able to see outside. It felt like I was being trapped inside. My dad is claustrophobic as well, and so the fact that I had this intense fear that was not something that was learned or as a result of my own experience also helped me identify that yes, this doesn't come from me. Identification is one thing. I think there also needs to be some sort of restorative practice to help you shed those emotions and leave them where they are. Other ways that family trauma or intergenerational trauma can play out in our lives or in generations to follow are in ways that we may not always think of. There is something in the book referred to as a family system. And so your family system includes people in your family, but it also includes people that your family members have either hurt or people who have hurt your family members. In the book, there was this case where this young boy, let's call him Jesse. Jesse was repeatedly running into this wall and he would injure his head, and so his parents decided to take him to a therapist to see what was going on. Come to find out, his grandfather actually was decapitated. He was murdered during some sort of civil war that was going on, and his grandmother remarried. The man that this young boy Jesse knew as his grandfather was actually his dad's stepfather, not his direct grandfather. And so what the therapist said was that the child was reenacting his grandfather's death. What this therapist suggested they do is that they get a picture of his actual grandfather, they tell the child this is your grandfather, and they hang it in the child's room. So they did that, and the boy ceased running into the wall. What I thought was so interesting about that particular case is that it wasn't necessarily having feelings to do with shame or guilt and regret in the past. Instead, it was more a matter of recognition and naming. There was this trauma that had happened in the family, and it was playing out in the following generation, not in the sense of shame, but more in the sense of that grandfather feeling a need to be named and be acknowledged. And so with that, I found like the similarity between the psychology of intergenerational trauma and African spirituality. I think it's so interesting how the mere acknowledgement brought some kind of resolution. And I think that with that, as a generation, as the new adults, as they say, we need to become more comfortable with speaking of the nitty-gritties and things that have happened in the past. I really do enjoy speaking to my parents about their lives before they became parents, their lives as children, and even getting to know my great-grandparents' experiences and what their family structures were. I think there's a lot of restoration in naming and acknowledging and just seeing our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, even if they've long passed, as individuals first before they're anybody's parents. On the flip, there are also traumas that we experience as a result of our own lived experience. I think a big thing that we see, particularly in Black and brown households, is trauma that gets passed down, particularly through discipline. Discipline, a lot of the times, is a site for pain and trauma and shame for Black and brown children. And a lot of the times where tenderness and empathy and patience may have been necessity, Black and brown children have more so been met with spanking and shaming and being yelled at. And that is not to say that Black and brown parents do not have the same capabilities for tenderness and empathy, but I think a lot of the times specific groups have been more in situations of survival and fight or flight, and not necessarily as many times are able to be stay-at-home moms that they have the bandwidth. A lot of the times when you're on survival mode and you're trying to figure out food for the night, or you've just lost your job or whatever it may be, and not to say that white households or other race households are not also going through the difficulties and woes of life and adulthood, but the rate and the statistics specifically here in South Africa, I think they really do differ, and I think that really does affect the ways in which different demographics are able to parent and the ways in which they're also able to discipline. And so we see this generational thing that yelling is a go-to, being spanked is a go-to, shaming is a go-to, and what this does is it creates a generational pattern and a site for trauma that is not resolved until we, as the new generation, have the conversation with our parents and equipped ourselves with the tools to know what we will and won't do with our own kids one day if we so choose. I think a lot of the times when it comes to things that we will or won't do with the children that we either have or plan to have, we think, of course I'm going to spank my children. I was spanked and I'm okay. And we forget the emotions we felt in the moments that we were being spanked. We forget the bigness of the emotion, and we look at ourselves as a case study that, I'm all right and I was spanked. But if you're actually to do a deep dive into the effects of children who were spanked today, I mean, I read this, and mind you, I'm a person who used to say, you better believe I'm going to hit those kids. I used to think that is the way to discipline. They hit me, okay? And that's no shade to my mother, but no, she did, okay? I used to think that because I am okay, EQ on a trill, IQ on a trill, nervous system regulated, that here I am, I'm okay, perfect case study, the girl has got manners, the girl is a-okay, the kids will be hit. But I realized a by effect, a consequence of children who are hit sometimes is that in moments of anger, they end up stonewalling, they end up ignoring people when they're upset. And that is something I frequently do. I even still do it right now as an adult. When I'm upset, I just completely shut down. And that is because when children are spanked, they are taught that they cannot express their anger. It's not safe for them to express their anger, and so they bottle and they suppress and they stonewall. But that is just one particular example. All in all, there are different ways to experience trauma. I mean, there are different traumas altogether. I think it is essentially impossible to leave life without having some kind of trauma and wounds that you've gone through. With the bigness of things that we are bound to go through in this life, the house should be the last place to experience trauma. And I think a lot of the times There are things that happen in family structures. You know, people experience loss. There may be death. There may be the loss of a job. A parent may be addicted to drugs, might be an alcoholic. And so instead of there being some kind of trauma-based care and specific nurturing given to children, instead they are met with being spanked as a form of discipline. They are met with being yelled at as a form of discipline. And so this puts them in an even more prolonged sense of stress and gives them toxic stress in a way that changes their genetics and sets the scene for their traumas to be passed down. A lot of the times we forget with children, they are still in the process of acquiring the tools to cope. And so when we see a child act out, when we see a child be quick to hit, be quick to yell, not respond to instruction, the response is hitting, yelling, and shaming, where the response needs to be about regulating their nervous system, speaking to them and reminding them about the power dynamic, reminding them how things are done, reminding them about wrong or right. There are even only certain ages that children know what wrong and right are. But in the height of frustration, in the height of stress of a parent, parents are very quick to hit and shame as opposed to teach. Again, as a result of the parenting that they got. And I think that is the really complex thing about being a child who has a high EQ, or being a person in general who has the tools and being frustrated that the adults around you might not have that same tools. And I've come across many people, friends, where they actually have to parent their parents. They have to be the ones who are quick to say sorry, because sorry is not a word that is in their parents' vocabulary. They are the ones that are quick to remedy the situation, because they have a parent where if they don't remedy it, the situation and the tension in the home will persist. And so those are different sides of traumas where on the surface it might not sound like trauma, but trauma doesn't always materialize itself as being hit and being yelled at. Trauma can also arise as a result of things that you didn't get. Trauma is not only inflicted by action, it is also inflicted by neglect. If you were never told, I love you, I'm proud of you, affection was never there, you didn't have the chance to play, you didn't have the chance to express yourself or to have fun, those will also be sides of trauma. Trauma is not always bloody. Trauma is not always violent. Trauma can also be withholding of love, because every child needs the fundamentals of love and nurturing and play. Yes, play is a fundamental for a child's development. And I think that in the naming and the recognition, it can't end there. There needs to be a level of restoration. And sometimes, unfortunately, that onus does sit on the child, or the 20-something-year-old, or the teenager, or the 30-year-old. Sometimes it may sit on them to restore and remedy. And it is a tough pill to swallow. It is a tough cross to bear, but I think it is an important responsibility in a family, especially if you are breaking patterns and you are breaking curses and you're not allowing traumas of the past to find resolution in the next generation. Ultimately, there are ancestral wounds, there are collective griefs in every family, and it is a big responsibility to try to remedy it. But I think that conversation can really be a key driver to remedying a lot of past hurts, and also taking our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents off of the cross. Because at the end of the day, all of our parents, all of our mothers and fathers, they were ladies and women before they became parents. I think going to university at UCT, grew up such a mommy's girl, still am. Shout out my father too. I have lately also been a daddy's girl. Anyways, I think moving to Cape Town when I was 18 years old for university really for the first time helped me see my parents as parents. Before Ogutle's mom and dad, I was like, as Tiny is Tiny and Bonga is Bonga, and those are my peeps. For instance, like with my dad, I love my dad down, but one thing I don't like that my dad would do growing up is when he'd get frustrated, he would yell, and I'd be like, Dad, if you're gonna yell, I'm gonna bounce, please, like, please. And I realized my dad was quick to yell because my grandmother was also quick to yell. My grandmother's quick to yell, her grandfather was quick to yell. Why was her grandfather quick to yell? He is raising 10 kids. His wife has passed away. He doesn't have the tools. He's not thinking he must say to my grandmother, Izam, come cry on my chest. He's saying, girl, this is life. Keep going. This is life. This is not a game. And so it was instilled into her parenting and instilled into my father's parenting. But shame my dad, he don't even yell at And that is just a small tiny example, and Dad, don't take that to heart because you know you are my guy. For instance, my mom, my grandmother and my great-grandmother was a very stoic lady, incredibly stoic, and my grandmother too, she is like very, very super stoic. And my mom, I think, as a result of experiencing some of that stoicism, decided she's not going to give stoicism. So my mom is on the flip, and I think that is something we need to be mindful of when it comes to our parenting. What aspects of our parenting do we want to take from our parents, and what particular things do we want to leave behind and let it stay over there? It can end with them, it ends with us. I think those are just things to really, really be mindful of, in a way that may be lighthearted, like family traditions, but also in a more serious way when it comes to discipline and how do you want to deal with conflict. Key takeaways are that there is no resolution in secrecy. Now, looking at our parents as individuals before parents and recognizing sites for trauma and equipping ourselves with tools to not repeat those cycles. So if a site for trauma in your household was maybe freedom, maybe you weren't ever allowed to express yourself, maybe you weren't really allowed to go out with your friends, keep in mind that the feeling there for your parents may have been wanting to raise an obedient child as opposed to an expressive child, which I think is a trauma in itself. And this idea of like children must be heard and not seen is incredibly damaging, because it ends up teaching you that your place in this world is on the periphery. It ends up teaching you that your voice is not of high value. And so if freedom was a site for trauma for you, or a wound rather, then I think keep that in mind when it comes to how you raise your kids, because the way one individual or family or household will restore the histories of their trauma may not be the same that another family would. Where a site for pain may have been freedom for one family, because that was not necessarily, I mean, I was really allowed to express myself as a child. I was allowed to have sleepovers with people that my parents knew and felt like it was safe. But I think the most important thing and the key takeaway I want to leave us with here today is that when it comes to hidden trauma and buried trauma, what is of utmost importance is bringing yourself back down to baseline. Your own baseline, not anybody else's baseline, not a baseline that's been inherited, not one that is steeped in fight or flight, but bringing yourself back down to your baseline so you don't have fears that are not yours, you don't have wounds and shame and guilt that was never yours to carry. And on the flip, I think the necessity to heal familial trauma, ones that you are aware of, ones that you may have grown up seeing, is to make sure that curses and patterns and cycles don't persist in your family and don't worsen over time. And relationships that require healing are able to be healed as a result of tenderness and nurturing and care. That's what I'd like to leave you with today, friends. The sun has left. Shout out the flowers. Oh, is this? Oh my gosh. What happened? She fell. Oh my word. Literally crumbled. Guys, literally don't even look at her. She's still taking it though by a smell. Friends, that is all for today. If you have stayed this long, I thank you. I adore you. I love you. And I'll catch you in the next one. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And most importantly, share, put the people on. This has been me, your girl, your host, Ogutle Khulashem. Catch you on the flip.